Hi everyone, welcome to my wormery. What you see here is my my new bin that I'm preparing. Not quite done preparing it yet. I've still got some leaves and some water with which I'm going to wet all these materials down, and then I'm going to let the bin sit until tomorrow. My aim is to populate the bin tomorrow with the worms that are going to come out of the two bins you see here behind me. The two bins are the bins that we've been referring to up until now as my sister bins. And you can see that I've removed the covers from them. You'll remember that I had upside down bins used to retain the moisture within the bins. So this bin here is going to be utilized to do sort of a finishing stage on all the collected compost that I harvest from these two bins. And I'll be attempting to bait the worms out of that bin, so that we're really left with finished compost only. The worms that are in the feeding zones on these are going to be used to populate the new bin. So the one thing I wanted to do today is to bring out those two sister bins, put them on the bench, and just take a glance at how the migrations are progressing. I've done an inspection on those two bins, and I had made a determination that I was just going to let them run out the way they were. But the following day I returned to those two bins and I perforated the barrier separating the compost from the new feeding zone. And that was to let the worms traverse that barrier more easily and get into the feeding zone, and to more easily sense the food in the feeding zone. The other thing that I did was I added a bunch of additional food to those feeding zones to increase the appeal of that area in the hopes that it would attract the worms. It's been 6 days now since I've done that, and I'm going to put on a glove and we're going to inspect those feeding zones together to see how the populations are making their way into those feeding zones. And hopefully it's a little better than we saw last week, because last week it was not as good as I had hoped. So let's take a peek at how things are progressing. Just tip the camera down and we'll get the bins out here momentarily. Okay. Now, so let's see what we can see in here. All right, so one of the main items that I added was cantaloupe. And it appears that the cantaloupe is being consumed quite nicely. Other things that you can see that I added in here are rice. See a couple grains of rice here and there as well. Down the middle, here's another hunk of cantaloupe rind, and it's actually getting pretty thin at this point. Not much left to it. So it does seem like it's doing its job in terms of attracting the worms to this area. And I would say that things are looking pretty good over here. I'll pick up that cardboard. But you know what? Let me move this stuff aside so it's just easier in general to see what's happening in here. Just grab a couple scoops full of stuff just so we can poke around a little bit more easily. Alright, so I can see that the stuff that I put in here last week is doing its job in terms of attracting the worms. I believe that the other bin is the one that appeared to be going a little bit slower, because I think that was the bin that had that double layer of cardboard blocking the new feeding zone from the compost. So that's the one that I'm really hoping has had a chance to catch up over the past week. The other thing we're going to want to take a quick peek at here before we return it to the shelf is the compost itself, just to see how the worms are coming along. Is it still fairly heavily populated with worms, or have they all started making their way over to the new feeding zone? So kind of like we saw last time, there are still worms here and there throughout the middle area, but it was this end over here which had been the prior feeding zone, which is where we saw a lot of the worms last time we checked, and we did agitate the material around a fair bit at that point. So that might have actually gotten the worms sort of up and at them. And I think that that helped, because I don't think that I'm seeing any sort of a major concentration of worms over on this side. We should be able to work our way through this material pretty quickly, since there doesn't seem to be a tremendous number of worms remaining in this compost anymore. And I think the main reason we're probably going to use the sifter as well is to try to remove a lot of this smaller particulate matter, such as these pumpkin seeds, some sticks. There are pistachio shells here and there as well. So I'd really like to round those up and make sure they're not part of my finished compost if possible. So why don't we take a peek at how the other one is doing? It's a rock, I believe. You can tell that the material is nice and crumbly, so if I go to sift it and I try to put it into my sifter, then it should pass through pretty easily. It should make the sifting process go pretty quick. This is good. I think this is going to work really well tomorrow. Store these covers onto the material. Let's see how the other bin's progressing. Now this is that piece that was in here as a secondary barrier that I simply removed. Now I'm just using it as a cover. Let's do what we did earlier on the other bin, which is just to remove some of this top layer. I think I like what I see already. The cantaloupe is doing its job. It does seem like it has a little bit more meat left on the rind than the other pieces did in the other bin. So this stuff isn't really breaking down as quickly as it was in the other bin, but that's fine, because I do see a fairly abundant number of worms in here, which is a lot better than it was last time we checked a week ago. So the perforations that I made into this cardboard here that remained, as well as putting in these tempting food items, appears to be doing its job, rounding up the worms to get them over onto this side of the bin. So this is very promising. I guess the proof will be when we take a look at the material itself, just to see how heavily populated it is at this point with worms. Get this covered back up as well. Alright, so once again, I believe that this far end is where the previous feeding zone had been, so that's where we would expect to find a large concentration of worms. And there are worms here and there throughout the material, which is to be expected, but I'm not seeing any sort of massive concentrations of worms anywhere. So it's big pieces of wood like this, and here again pistachio and other larger particles of food. And as you can see, the material is really nice and flaky. And then once I've got all these separated and I've got the castings only, or for the most part castings only, I'm going to be going through sort of a final migration. All the material that comes out of this bin and the other bin, I'm going to be putting into that larger deep bin that's behind me. And then I'll be attempting to bait the worms out of that, allowing time for any cocoons that might be in the material to hatch, and also just to attract any straggler worms that made their way through the sifting process. Well, I'm going to put this bin back up on the shelf, and then I'm going to continue with prepping the bin for tomorrow to make it into a nice suitable home for the worms once I move them out of these bins. But I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's kind of mundane, boring stuff. Just got to add a little bit of water, maybe some leaves, and then that bin should be set to go to be populated tomorrow. Alright everybody, why don't we finish up with that, and probably do a video tomorrow as well, just to capture some of the process. It's a somewhat time-consuming process filtering the material through, especially for 2 bins. So maybe I'll just capture bits and pieces of that, just to keep everyone abreast of what's happening. But for now, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I appreciate everyone's company. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and consider subscribing to my channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.